Well, if you haven't been paying attention, there's been a lot of issues culturally in the United States for the last 60, 75, perhaps even 100 years. And it really goes back to the family, the individual. We've talked about on this broadcast before how a nation's like a body, and that body is comprised of cells. And those cells are the individuals and then the families, which is the most important part of the body. And if those cells are corrupt, then the whole body is susceptible to illness. So you can't just put a topical treatment on the whole body, do a whole body approach and try to fix the issue. You have to get down to the base level, to the cell, and that is to the family and the individuals there within to make the body better. And that is what we are struggling with, I believe, in the United States of America. We have a cell problem, a family problem, and that's why we are sick. And unless and until we get to that root cause, we're never going to fix the issue with some sort of a topical solution or top-down solution. So I want to talk about that today. And there's nobody I know, I think, in my opinion, more qualified to do that than Abraham Hamilton III. We were just talking before we went live, and I told Abe that I've been listening to his great show, The Hamilton Corner, which airs on American Family Radio. It's also on all the podcasting platforms and YouTube. If he doesn't get banned from there for saying the truth, you can find it there. And Abe is just great. He's a homeschool dad. He's a lawyer. He works for the American Family Association. There he is their general counsel and public policy analyst, which he is terrific. If you get to listen to his show, which I highly recommend, his takes are exceptional. The show airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Central. He's the host of that program, and he's done so much for liberty. He's also, as I mentioned, a lawyer. He has an undergraduate degree in New Testament biblical literature and a Juris Doctorate degree. And most importantly, he's a fellow believer in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, which shines through all he does. Abe, thank you so much for joining us on American Made today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Andrew, for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, brother. So let's talk a little bit about the family, getting married, having kids. I mean, this has just become countercultural, even though it's been the norm since Genesis 1, God instituted the family. But it seems recently we have this movement to go against, I believe it's a satanic movement, to go against what God instituted. And we're seeing that through all of these various movements. The feminist movement, which has really tried to upend the nuclear family. You always say in your broadcasts that what goes on in our house is more important than what goes on in the White House. Just give us a general explanation of why that is so and how we might turn the tide on this issue.
Yeah, man, it's instructive for us that when the creator of heaven and earth unfolded all of human history, he did so in a particular manner and recorded that for our benefit. And what I'm describing is that the first human institution that God established was the family. Before you get to modern iterations of civil government, before you even get to a New Testament church, before you get to orders of priests, prophets, things of that nature, the first human institution that God established was the family. The first command given to mankind, interestingly enough, before you ever get to you shall not murder, you shall not steal, the first command was issued to mankind within the familial context, and that was to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. The simple reality is we will never be able to outpolitic or outvote or even outchurch, frankly, deficiencies that abound in the home. The home is the fundamental building block of any civilization. The home is the fundamental building block of society. It is the fundamental building block of the church. And so if we don't, to take your metaphor about the nation being like a body, if we don't address the body at the cellular level, we can never expect to have, metastasizing illnesses corrected. We'll never be able to address deficiencies in joints and ligaments. We have to have the correction at the cellular level. And it's unfortunate that people who are, frankly, I would say haters of God and haters of liberty that tend to run in the same track, if they're not the same people, they tend to understand this, unfortunately, which is why you have people like Karl Marx and others who sought to make the family an enemy of their aims, because they recognized if we have intact, strong nuclear families, we'll be less inclined to imbibe the Marxist opiates. You know what I mean? So it's harder to persuade people that they're perpetually oppressed if they're coming from strong, grounded, loving families, which we know in the American framework sets the foundation for being able to pursue liberty, and happiness having been given life. So that's really the fundamental foundational notion that I often advocate for.
Absolutely. And this ideology is even leaked into the church where it's, wait till you are financially situated to get married, don't have tons of kids, this kind of anti-family jargon. And when you get to the heart of it, ultimately, it seems to have kind of a materialist veneer over the whole surface of it, right? You have to be able to be in a position to go to Disney World 5 times a year and have two, Chevy Tahoes to be able to cart the family around. And it creates this really economical impossibility, particularly for somebody in their early 20s, to actually take the plunge and get married and start to be fruitful and multiply. I mean, what is this elevator pitch against that sort of ideology in a Christian church context? Because I come across this a lot where there's young men who I know would love to get married, who would love to start having a family, but they've just been told over and over again, well, you have to be completely financially set before you take that plunge. What should be the response to that?
Yeah, one of the major things I hear that often as well. I said, so are you saying to me that if a couple encounters economic hardship having been married, does that mean they should be divorced because they have some economic difficulty? And it's a fool's errand. And what you said is absolutely right. It stems from a materialist foundation that is an echo of a really narcissistic, self-centered society that we've become. One of the foundational components that we should understand from marriage is that it is one of God's primary mechanisms to move us from adolescence to maturity. And one of the major touchstones of maturity is that we become selfless in our orientation. It is the mechanism that God moves males into being men, in that we have now the foremost concern of our wives and then ultimately our children. It moves girls into being women because their foremost concern becomes their husband and their children. And this really, that ideology is a result of this, what I describe as a protracted or an arresting of development, to where we have a society that's filled with adult-sized human beings, but with adolescent makeups, worldviews, and internal compositions, which is why you have the phenomenon. I'm not trying to throw shade on anybody, but which is why it's so prevalent now for adults to be given to video games and things of that nature. And I'm not saying that they're automatically inherently sinful, anything like that, but it does bring to the fore this idea that generations past, we had people who approach maturity a bit sooner than we do now. So this protraction and arresting of development is really an extension of a narcissistic, self-centered disposition, kind of like a baby when they're young and they're hungry and they're crying. They don't know to be concerned about anybody other than themselves. So then you often have the crying and the temper tantrums that follow. Well, this idea that, well, you have to have this amount of money in the bank, you have to have this personal accomplishment before you could actually take on the responsibility of a family, is an extension of that adolescent self-centered disposition that really cuts against having stabilized societies.
Absolutely. And you can't talk about the next generation and how this is compounded without touching on education. Of course, you and I know, as well as hopefully a lot of our viewers, that public education and the institution of that in the United States, and just a compulsory fashion, and then also just the cultural normalcy of sending your children off to a government institution for most of the day, most of the week, has really been counterintuitive, to say the least, to say it mildly, to this whole going back to what God instituted, article or argument that we're trying to make here. Going back to that public school, it seems to me is something you can't divorce from this conversation, because if we try to get back to God's design, parents shepherding their children is a key function to that. And I just can't even see logistically how that could be possible with your kids being in a government school for so much of the time out of the week. What are your thoughts on that? Is this a delegation crisis where parents are just focused on the material? Is there a spiritual element to this as well, where there's, perhaps a Luciferian movement in the United States to corrupt children's worldview? What is your take on that, and just home education versus public school as a whole?
Yeah. My take on it is yes, all of the above. We're talking about this, like this protraction of adolescence. Really, it stems from a worldview and it's a normalization of a worldview that rivals Christ. But the question that should come to the fore, then how does this worldview become so ubiquitous in our society? And what you touched on when you say education, you've touched on the primary vehicle for this transmission of this ideology. Former Supreme Court Justice, now retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer let the cat out of the bag in the Carson versus Macon case. And in Carson versus Macon, it was a school choice case from Maine. But in his dissent, on page 10 of his dissent, he said something out loud publicly that I've been shouting from the rooftops, but to have a Supreme Court justice admit it really just crystallized it for me. On page 10 of his dissent, he made the argument that, school choice should be rejected. And I'm not even going to get into the whole vouchers thing right now because I have opinions on that. But he argued that the reason why government schools should remain the only source of schools that should be funded, because this is what he says on page 10, that government schools serving a solely civic purpose, that it is the primary values transmission mechanism upon which our democratic society rests, end quote. That's literally what he said. So most parents thought we send children to schools for reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer said, no, you're going for values transmission. So then the question should be, wait a minute. What values are being transmitted? The values that are being transmitted are the ones that are leading to a society that, though we had in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, we have now in the 21st century, democratic socialists popularly running for president. That doesn't happen overnight. That happens because, and I call it mind cultivation. Cultivation of the mind is central to discipleship. Because God has set society up the way he has, discipleship is a constant. It's going to happen. The question is, who is going to do the discipling? What worldview is the discipler conveying to the disciples? What values, to use Stephen Breyer's terms, are being transmitted? And what we're witnessing is that we've had a massive turn of America to secularization. How has that happened? By and large, through the education system. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandments were, he gave two. The first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and your strength. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Loving the Lord with our minds is central to being disciples of Jesus Christ. Cultivation of the mind is central to being a disciple. If we are not taking the responsibility of cultivating the minds of our children, someone will do it. And when that transpires, it is often someone cultivating the minds of our children in a direction that rivals us, and more importantly, that rivals God. I cannot tell you how many conversations I had with people when parents would say, I didn't raise my son or daughter to be this way. How did they become this way? And I've had to have some hard conversations. I simply had to ask the question, well, where did you send them to be discipled? If you are not discipling them, where are you sending them to be discipled? And what often occurs, the discipleship is taking place in these indoctrination locations that we happen to call government schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, play devil's advocate here, I'm going to throw, two classic Christian, counter arguments to that. Well, Abe, what about, my little Johnny, who's 6 years old? He can be a Christian light to his brothers and sisters potentially in public school. Why should he not be able to evangelize to his fellow young kids at public school? Why not?
Yeah, I'll just give we start with the scriptures first. The Bible is clear in saying that evil company corrupts good morals. The script, he who walks with the wise shall become wise himself. The question should be, well, is that wisdom there? But then I would just ask a very simple question. Would you send a adolescent, untrained person to be a foreign missionary to a foreign country, even as an adult? Which the obvious question usually is, no. Would you send a person, maybe a brand new convert to Christianity, who has no biblical training, no grounding, but would you send them to be, a missionary in a foreign hostile country, Nigeria, Sudan, a Muslim majority country? Would you do that? The obvious question is no. Well, why would you do that with your 6-year-old? Then the other question I would ask is simply put, and the reality is, over 90+%, closer to 95% of Christians send their children to public schools right now. How is that evangelism mission going? Yeah. It's pretty obvious what the answer is. And the simple fact is we have people and we have Christians who often are well-meaning, but sincerity and meaning doesn't mean that your position is right or true. right? So we have people who are sincere, but simply sincerely wrong. I would never want to send my child, as a sheep to the slaughter, being untrained, unprepared, required in many instances to stand their ground against influential adults if the adult asserts a position that's contrary to what the scripture teaches, and to say, yeah, and by doing so, they're going to be the most effective evangelists in this system. It's just a fool's errand, and the statistics, the evidence, and our experiences show that that's not effective. Now, I'm not saying that our experiences where you have children that survive the government school system, and I literally mean that, survive it, but what is the reality in terms of how many children from Christian homes survive the government indoctrination system and come out as passionate, committed, lifelong followers of Jesus Christ? What often happens is you have people who either abandon the faith in total, or they become at best nominal Christians that really imbibe really a secular anti-Christian worldview, but they place kind of a profession veneer on the top of that secular worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other critique that's also given to the argument that you and I are making here is, well, I live in small town Ohio, or I live in Florida, and our public schools don't do any of the stuff that you might see in New York or LA or St. Louis or Chicago. What would be your response to that?
I say very, very, very plainly, if the assertion is that because I'm in a small town that I am and my children are immune from the stuff that's coming out of, for example, like Southern California, New York, things of that nature, I would just say that is an often ignorant assertion. And I don't mean ignorance as a pejorative. It just simply means you just don't know, because the influences are not solely from the brick and mortar building. It's not solely from the teacher or the administrator. One of the things that people often neglect is peer learning, one of the most influential sources of influence in the life of any child. And if you think about your own lives, it's been true in our experiences as well, comes from what the peers communicate. Secondarily, you don't have to go to the world to be influenced by the world. Right now, you have these devices. I don't know if you heard of them. They call them phones, but they really are supercomputers that are carried in pocket sizes, to where the influences of the world are coming to your doorstep. I'll never forget, I was in a rural town in Virginia. I had a ministry event where I was speaking, and it's farms everywhere, and I saw two little children that got off a yellow school bus. And immediately when they got off the school bus in a country farm town, I see these children doing what I know to be these like TikTok dances. I know the parents have no clue where these dances have come from. Yet the TikTok dances from the people who are in San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles and other places around the country, they're coming to rural Virginia through the means of these devices. And even if the children don't have them themselves, their peers have these devices. And so what I'm suggesting is not sheltering from the world. As you mentioned, I'm a homeschool dad. I tell people all the time, I'm not sheltering my children from the world, training my children and discipling them and cultivating their minds at home to keep them out of the world. I'm sheltering them for the world. I want to be able to launch them into the world, as Psalm 127 uses the simile that children are like arrows in the quiver of a mighty warrior. I am training my children for the express purposes of launching them into the world. But upon launching them, I want to do so with intentionality and for the purposes of them being effective in the world and not being affected by the world. I'm not sheltering them from the world. I'm sheltering them for the world. And we understand this in a practical sense when we have military service members who are recruited, right? We are recruiting military service members for express purposes of filling our military with people who will catch, search, kill, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America. When we get new recruits, do we get new recruits and say, hey, straight to the front lines of battle with you? Is that what we do? No. What do? We get new recruits, and what do? We send them to basic training. We send them to boot camp. We give them skills. We give them weapons trainings. We give them preparation. Why? Because the whole purpose of recruiting them is so that they are successful in war fighting. The purpose of sheltering our children for the world is so that they're successful. And contrary to what people may want to admit, the scripture teaches there is a war raging. It's not guns and bullets, but it's a war for the souls of men. And I often say Satan's strategy is two-pronged. First prong, keep as many people as possible from receiving the gospel, if possible. But the second prong, if you can't do that, is to limit us and our effectiveness as believers. In Peter's epistle, he said, if these qualities are yours and they're abounding, they'll fortify you against being barren and unproductive in your knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. We have lots of people that profess to be followers of Jesus Christ, but how fruitful and productive are they in that profession? Many times and in many ways, what's happened is that we have people who have imbibed various iterations of worldliness, but they have a Christian church attendance veneer placed on top of it, which resulted in minimal fruit producing, minimal impact, which is why much of what professes to be Christianity today really is indistinguishable from the prevailing world and society around us.
Absolutely. And, you know, with public education too, it's by nature a religious institution. When you look at the origins of it with John Dewey, who was the founder of, public education. He was the architect of the Humanist Manifesto, which humanism is a religious worldview. Don't be confused that it is not. And when you go back and look at the origins of the public education model, it was built on a Prussian model, which was created for the exact utility of making bureaucratic cogs in a machine to produce a tyrannical totalitarian state of people who didn't think freely, people who didn't rebel against the system, didn't understand that their rights came from God, not from government. So this is a machine that hasn't gone wayward from an original vision that was honorable. It's a institution that's actually executing with even more efficiency the original agenda that it was set out to do. And like you said, just look at the results. Look at the 20 and 30-year-olds who are more likely to vote for a Bernie Sanders type than a Ron Paul type. I mean, it's just a massive gap that's been created. And that is because they were raised in a system that taught them to think that way. And that is what we're dealing with. So we have about 10 minutes left here. I want to shift to politics, and everything we've been talking about is political in nature as well, but just a little bit more obvious. You know, what we've been seeing over the last 100 days has been positive. President Trump has been undoing and doing a lot of things that are more in step with what our founding fathers envisioned of a constitutional republic. It's not perfect, but it's definitely the step in the right direction. But one thing, Abe, that I'm looking at with this, and I'm feeling a little bit concerned about, is the lack of congressional action. We're seeing the executive do a lot, and I think even in the conservative sphere, we've replace the executive order for an act of Congress, which is a big mistake. You know, they don't have the same power. We still need the Article 1 functions of our government to execute the will of the people legislatively and protect our Constitution. What are your thoughts on this? How can we make the progress we're seeing more effective, more codified in law, and what can local people do to make that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Executive order is no way to govern enduringly. We've already witnessed an executive order, once it's implemented, it can be immediately rescinded with the next administration. And so while I certainly celebrate many of the executive orders that President Trump has signed, I am gravely concerned that all of these things have the potential, as it stands right now, as you and I are talking, to be immediately filed into the dustbin with the new administration, regardless of who that administration might be. And so what I would like to see happen, since we've passed this 100-day mark, is more pressure put on Congress to codify many of the things that President Trump has done at the executive level. Without congressional participation, all of these things can be immediately reversed. And I understand a lot of the different things at play. For example, President Trump, this is his last term constitutionally that he can serve. So what he needs to do, he has to do within really this first 6 months or so of this administration, because as soon as you turn the clock, you have midterm elections coming up in 2026. You have a full third of the Senate that is up for election. You have the House of Representatives that's up for election again. And so much of Congress is going to be focusing on campaigning. And so what needs to occur is President Trump needs to put some pressure on these guys and these women to say, hey, these things that I've initiated, we need you to make them lasting. You know, President Trump's tax cuts, for example, from his first term, they're about to expire. So if Congress doesn't act, we're going to have a tax hike by virtue of nothing being done. You know, that's just one example of that. Executive fiat is not any way to have enduring government. And so pressure needs to be placed on these elected officials. And to your point in question about what can people do at home, first, we need to be aware that that's what's happening. And then secondarily, we at home need to put pressure on our Congress members. Midterms are coming up 2026. We need to be able to say, hey, if you are applying to me for a job to be sent back to Washington, D.C., I am requiring you to do this now. These things need to be put into place now. One of the other areas that's become an albatross in this current time is the outsized role that federal district court judges are playing. A lot of times people don't realize that federal district courts are Article 3 courts in current U.S. Constitution Article 3, which means they serve at the behest of Congress.
That's right.
Congress is the branch of the federal government that has the direct capacity to rein these judges in, or if necessary, Congress can dismantle and reconstitute Article 3 courts, which would give President Trump the opportunity to freshly appoint new judges in these courts. These are things that need to be done not tomorrow, need to be done now to put us on the course to have more enduring change that's established, as opposed to President Trump doing it all at the executive level, which, as we already discussed, can be reversed immediately with an incoming new administration.
Yep. And Article 1, Section 8, clearly spells out that, hey, if you don't want, all these random programs that aren't listed in Article 1, Section 8, it's Congress's job. They hold the power of the purse. You don't like USAID, it's going to take Congress. DOJ can expose the corruption, but it's going to take Congress to pull the money back. As same with, the Department of Education. Trump gutted it, but it's it's not gone. It's going to take Congress to repeal it. You don't like what's going on at the United Nations. It's going to take Congress to get out of the United Nations ultimately. The same with the endless wars, Russia, Ukraine. Congress is supposed to declare an act of war to go to war, but we've been sending money and sending missiles and weaponry, and that has been done through the approval of the Congress. So we're going to have to start looking to them to see actual change on this. And I want to talk a little bit in the final 4 minutes or so we have left here, just about the narrative shift. You talked on your show, the Hamilton Corner, the other day about, Trump signing the executive order, getting rid of the gain of function research. Now we have this lab leak, narrative that used to be, totally off limits, totally conspiratorial. Yeah, exactly. Now it's, everyone's coming around to it was a lab leak. There was gain of function research. The same could be true with like the Great Reset theory, right? That at one point that was completely off limits, conspiratorial, even though it was on the World Economic Forum's website and the UN was talking about it. But we're starting to see this pivot of things that used to be completely fringe now becoming mainstream. How can we sustain this? I'm just thinking about the sustainability element of this. And of course, you can't divorce the sustainability without having the education. And that education has to come from a religious fervor and a biblical Christian worldview that motivates and convicts the people. But how do you see this moving forward where we push this even further and have sustainability?
Yeah, I think doing things that we're doing right now, your program, my program, and not just the programs, but within our spheres of influence, sharing this information. One of the things that I heard one time was like, that's so not true. They said people of faith are not very studious and intelligent. I'm like, are you insane? That's one of the most oxymoronic statements I've ever heard in my life, because so much of innovation and things have transpired as a result of people who have a biblical worldview, who were armed with the scriptures that led them to study, led them to experiment, led them to pursue these different things. And so one of the things that is enduring for a believer, as you mentioned earlier, that cultivation of the mind is central to being a disciple. One of the qualities that Peter identified, that if they be yours and they abound, is knowledge. That we share this information, that we don't just keep it to ourselves, but we share this information as broadly as we can. One of the things, the comments I get all the time is like, Abe, I hear things on your show that I don't hear in other places. And that is by design in many instances, but it also is a great detriment because, just for example, there were scores of Democrat voters who had voted for Joe Biden who were completely unaware of Hunter Biden's laptop story because of the massive efforts to censor the dissemination of that information, who literally said, had I known about the laptop story before the 2020 election, I never would have voted for Joe Biden. Well, that happens because we have these silos of information, but we need to try to pierce that, communicate with our neighbors, communicate with our loved ones, start in our own homes with our own families, but then branch out from there, communicate with people, engage our communities, engage our societies, share information with a consistency and a persistence that is replete with evidence of love for our neighbor. One of the ways we can love our neighbor is by helping our neighbors remain informed. And by doing so, we continue loosening and lessening the winnowing grip of the mainstream legacy media, but also loving our neighbors by providing them information that they need to be the type of citizens that can hold our public servants accountable.
Amen. Yeah, we don't want to be information gluttons, right? Where we just consume and we're an expert on every issue, but then we do absolutely nothing with it. At that point, it's just completely pointless. So, Abe, we're out of time here. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. People need to check out your show, The Hamilton Corner, on American Family Radio. How can they do that and follow your work?
Yes, you can go, like Andrew said, American Family Radio. If you want to know what station is available in your local area, we're on over about 180 stations around the country. Simply go to afr.net, or you can subscribe to the show via podcast. You can listen live on the radio show. You can watch live on YouTube, on Facebook, My show also comes on television on Friday evenings on National Religious Broadcasters, NRB TV. That would be 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can follow me on all socials at Hamilton Corner. And that's how you can stay connected.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, sir, for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. And folks, you got to check out the show. Like I said at the beginning of the program, I've been watching it for years, listening to it for years, and I've shared it with multiple friends, and it is really a worthwhile listen. You're not going to be disappointed. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of American Made. I'm your host, Andrew Muller. Don't be an information glutton. Share this with a few friends, have some good conversations, and be a force multiplier, folks. We're not going to take back our country unless we do that at the local level and do it to honor God, to advance his kingdom, because ultimately that's what we are striving for. So until next time, keep it local, keep it honoring to God and his kingdom, and keep it